Lambton College Alumni Association. In 2022, we launched the Graduate Services and Support Center, which is a service for our international graduates, providing resources and support as they embark on their journeys to permanent residency and settling into life in Canada post-graduation. And of course, one of the biggest components of that is finding work. Lambton College has a large number of incredibly strong, talented, and ready to work international graduates. We are thrilled to present today Elizabeth Long and Zia Sumar, immigration lawyers from the law firm of Long Mangoji, to educate you, employers, on the process of immigration law and hiring our international graduates. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope you find that this session is valuable. And for now, I'm going to pass it off to Elizabeth and Zia. Thank you both in advance for your time today.
Thank you so much, Ashley. It's fantastic to be here. Just some housekeeping. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be answering questions that you might have at the end of our presentation. So if during the presentation you think of any questions, please put them into the Q&A section on the bottom, and we'll do our best to answer your questions at the end. Okay. All right, let's get started. So today what we're going to be talking about is some of the immigration laws that you as employers who are employing graduates at Lambton College should understand with regard to when you can hire someone and what you might need to do.
So first, let's talk about when students can work in Canada. So what you want to know first is what their status is here in Canada, and that then determines what their abilities or what their limitations are in terms of working. So an international student who is a full-time student, they can use their study permit to actually work off campus up to 20 hours a week during the school year and full-time during any regularly scheduled breaks. So for example, where their programs have summer holidays, during those summer holidays, they'd be able to use their study permit to work full-time, so without any limitations during that break. Now, if the student is on any sort of authorized leave, so if they've left the program, or if they've taken a break from their program of study, or if they're not a full-time student, then that study permit doesn't allow them to work at all. So any authorized leaves, any part-time students are not able to work off campus using their study permit. Right now, there's currently a temporary policy in place. So full-time students who have study permits that they had applied for before October 7th, they're able to use that study permit to actually work full-time during the school year. So whereas normally there is the cap of 20 hours a week, right now, there is an exception up till the end of this year where they're able to work full-time even while they are studying. And the last thing to note for full-time students is that some full-time students will have a co-op portion to their program of study. While they are on their co-op, they'll have what's called a co-op work permit. That co-op work permit allows them to work full-time while they're studying, so during their semester, but only in the co-op position. So it doesn't allow them to work in any role. It's specific that the position has to be for the fulfillment of their co-op term. Now, a student who has finished their program, so once they've received any confirmation from the school that they've completed their program of study, at that point in time, they do have to stop working. So even though they may still have their study permit, or they had a co-op work permit previously, neither of those allow them to work in Canada and while they're waiting. So basically, once they've completed their program of study. Once they apply for their post-grad work permit, assuming that they had a study permit on the day that they submitted their post-grad work permit application, and they applied for their work permit within 90 days of completing their program, international students are actually able to start working full-time while they wait for a decision on that postgraduate work permit application. So in short, when we're looking at the big question of when students can work in Canada, it really comes back to what their status is here right now, what authorization they have, and what they're exactly doing. So again, full-time students can work using their study permit. That allows them to work up until they complete their program. Once their program is completed, they have to stop working until they apply for their post-grad work permit, at which point they can start working full-time.
Zia, this is quite complicated. So maybe let's run through a real life scenario here. Okay, let's say I have a student who's working for me. They're just going through final exams right now. And they're not doing any co-op work with me. So at that point, how many hours can they work?
So because they're still considered a full-time student, they can work up to 20 hours a week, unless their study permit right now was issued before October 7th, which means they fall under the temporary policy and they'd be able to work full-time.
Okay, so let's say they finish their exams, but they don't have their grades back yet. Can they work?
They finish their exams, but they don't have their grades. Yes, they're still considered to be a full-time student.
Okay, let's say they get their grades back and they've passed. Can they work? They don't have a degree yet or anything, but they've shown that they've passed everything.
Yeah, so as soon as they've received confirmation that they've passed their program, that means that they have completed their studies and they're no longer a student. So they're not authorized to work anymore using that study permit.
Okay, and then so they're not allowed to work at all, even if their co-op work permit is still valid, even if they still have a study permit.
Correct. Yeah. So the co-op work permit doesn't allow them to work anymore. Their study permit doesn't allow them to work anymore.
Okay. And then when can they start working again?
As soon as they apply for their post-grad work permit, assuming that they've applied within 90 days of completing their program, and on the day of their application, they still hold a valid study permit.
Okay. And so once they've applied, then how many hours can they work?
There's no limitation at that point.
Okay.
They
And
can
they
be full-time, yeah.
and they can start working even if they don't hold that work permit in their hand.
Correct, yeah. So while that work permit is in process, while that work permit application's in process, they can be working full-time.
Okay. All right. So now that it's so complicated, the system for students. It's often even complicated for lawyers to even try to navigate this. But it's very important as employers for you guys to know exactly when, how many hours they are able to work, so that they're not working without status. Now, as employers, it is important for you to conduct some due diligence into making sure that the students are eligible to work. Okay. And I often get clients coming to me and say, well, what do I need to ask them for? What do they need to show? So, I mean, the first one is the work permit. Once you have a work permit in hand, you need to check it and look at a few things. If they have an open work permit, so the post-graduation work permit is an open work permit, right? That allows them to work for anyone, but sometimes there is still a restriction there where it says not authorized to work in healthcare or with children, okay? And this restriction is there if they haven't done a medical. If they've done a medical, then they can apply for a work permit without that restriction. Also, the co-op work permit, it may not specify what kind of work they do, but the co-op work permit is very specific in that it's only for those kind of co-op programs that are integral to their education studies. So you can't just say, okay, they have a co-op work permit and it's still valid, so they can work for me, right? In my, in my work as an employer, it's not, they're finished their studies. No, the co-op work permit is only for co-op programs. Now, implied status is what happens when, and the third column that Zia was just talking about, a person, they applied for their post-grad work permit and they still had status. So the law allows them to work until a decision is made. Okay, so what you can do to ensure that someone has implied status, and the best way to do it is have them send you a screenshot of their portal, and on the portal it will show that the application has been submitted and that it's still in process. So as long as it's still in process, they have implied status. Okay, this is really important because IRCC sends out a very misleading letter. Okay, it sends out a letter to applicants to try to help them, but sometimes it's more harmful than help, because it says on that letter, there's a mistake on that letter, which says you are authorized to work until such and such date, or until a decision is made, whichever is earlier. And what that seems to imply is that once that date is reached, they can no longer work after that date, which is wrong. The law allows them to work for until a decision is made. So when those letters were written by whoever it was who wrote it, they assumed that work permits would be processed within 3 months, right? And so they put a 3-month date on that. It's just a stupid mistake that they did. Right now, work permits are taking well over 5 months sometimes to process. But that means that after that specific date that's on that work permit extension letter, they can still continue to work under the law. So the best way to check whether someone is eligible to work is have them send you a screenshot of the online portal where they would have submitted the application to show that an application is still in process. Okay, and you can also take a look when they applied as to whether or not their study permit was valid when they applied as well. So we have a lot of situations right now because there's been a lot of backlog in many of the applications, and it's been difficult sometimes for students to be able to apply for permanent residence before their work permit has expired. Okay, and so what do you do? So normally a person only gets one post-grad work permit in their life. And we always tell the students when they're still students to make sure that they plan their situation so that they can get permanent residency before their post-grad work permit expires. However, there has been, because of all these backlogs and situations, the government has seen that there's many international students who haven't been able to get their permanent residency before their post-grad work permit expires. So the government has now allowed for a extension for the post-grad work permit to allow students whose post-grad work permits expired in 2022, 2020, and this year as well, to apply for an 18-month open work permit. Okay. There are other kinds of work permits that are available. For example, if someone has applied for permanent residency, and we're going to talk about permanent residency in just a bit, and they reach a certain level of acceptance where they've gone through initial screening and the officer said, yes, you qualify, just wait, we'll get to it later. At that point, they'll be eligible for bridging work permit, and they can get an open work permit as well while waiting for the permanent residency. Other things such as provincial nominations. Provincial nominations are where the province has received authorization through an agreement by the federal government to choose people that they want to get permanent residency. And once they've chosen that person, they get a provincial nomination. And then we can go and apply for permanent residency based on that nomination. Zia is going to touch on that, but on many of these programs, if they have a provincial nomination, then we can apply for a work permit based on the provincial nomination while waiting for the permanent residency. Francophone work permits are really nice if you have an employee who is fluent in French. If they're fluent in French, it doesn't matter if, even if they don't speak French in their workplace, as long as they're fluent in French and as long as they have a job offer outside of Quebec that's high skilled, we can get a work permit for them. Free trade professional work permits. These are work permits based on free trade agreements that we have with certain countries. And for certain occupations and professionals, if they're nationals of those countries, if as long as they have a job offer, we can apply for a work permit for them. Most work permits, though, beyond the postgrad work permit, will require a LMIA. And what an LMIA is it's something where the employer has to apply to Service Canada to get an opinion showing that this job is needed in Canada and it's difficult to find a Canadian to do the job. Now, normally, an LMIA is kind of tedious because it does require the employer to advertise and show they can't find a Canadian for the position. But the government has now created a separate LMIA category called the Global Talent Stream for people who are in the IT industry and other kinds of engineers and more of the STEM occupations where you don't need to show recruitment of Canadians. Instead, you provide a labor market benefit plan showing that, for example, you're going to hire some Canadians in the future and you're going to train Canadian employees. Then we can get a LMIA, and it's very fast. It's normally within 2 weeks that we'll get the LMIA. Okay. All right, so let's move on to Express Entry. Express Entry is the most popular and the most well-known category for permanent residency for skilled workers in Canada. How it works is, first, you have to qualify. And if you qualify under one of three categories, the Federal Skilled Worker class, Canadian Experience class, and the Federal Skilled Trades class, you get to create an online profile. And if you create an online profile, then you will get to be in the Express Entry pool. Now, very important to understand, just because someone is in the pool, it doesn't mean that they have actually applied for permanent residency. If they're in the pool, they are just a candidate. They have expressed their interest to apply. What happens is once they're in the pool, they'll get a series of points based on their background and if they have provincial nomination. And every couple of weeks or so, the government has a draw where they invite people to apply based on how they qualified and their points. It's only after you get this invitation to apply that you can actually apply and submit your application. Okay, so it's not just enough to put in the pool. You need to make sure that you can get an invitation to apply, to submit your application. So there are three categories of programs where you can actually qualify. The first one is the Federal Skilled Worker class. This has been in place since my parents came to Canada in the 80s. And it's gone through different kinds of certain changes, but essentially it's based on a person's background. And even if someone is not in Canada, they can still qualify under this category. The second stage is Canadian Experience class. And this is one that many students qualify for. This is where if they have work experience in Canada that is not self-employed and it's high skilled, and it's not when they're a student, it's after when they're not a full-time student, they can qualify if they worked for 1 year in a high skilled position. This work experience is also very important to understand because this kind of work experience is the kind of work experience that also gives them extra points for Express Entry later on that we'll talk about. Third one, I'm not going to get into, there's not many people who qualify for this. This is for people in the trades as well. Okay, so once you're in the pool, why is this stuck? Sorry, hold on. Okay, so once you're in the pool, then we see, okay, how many points can you get? And so what are the factors that we look at as to how many points a person can get? Well, the first thing is age, right? Unfortunately, after you turn 30, every year that's a birthday, it's not necessarily a happy occasion, okay? Because every time it's in your 30s, your points drop by 5 or 6 points. In your 40s, it's a fast slide, -10, -11 points. By the time you're 45, the good news is the points don't go down anymore. Okay, the bad news is you get a big fat 0 for age. And so, you know, compared to someone in their 20s who has 110 points to someone in their 45 who has 0, that can be a significant difference. So sometimes if you have an older employee and you're saying, like, why can't they get PR when all these other people can get PR? It may be because of age. Education is important. If they have 2 programs or more, then they get a boost in their points. Language is also very important. Now, one thing I have to say about language exams is I feel that they don't necessarily measure completely that accurately a person's ability in their language, especially their ability to do their job. Instead, I find a lot of times that there are some people who are very good at taking exams and some people who are not very good at taking these exams. And I have many people whose first and only language is English, for example, who can't pass these exams. But these exams can make or break a person's ability to apply for permanent residence to get those points. And sometimes 0.5 in a language exam on one skill. So you have 4 skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And a 0.5 difference on that can mean the difference between a person being able to get the points and not get the points. And by that, I mean, sometimes it can be a difference in 90 points even, as to whether or not someone will get those points or not, just by 0.5. Work experience, relevant Canadian work experience. It's the same kind of work experience I just described for the Canadian experience class. If they have overseas work experience, that's also can help. It has to be high skilled. Spouses can add or take away a few points depending on, you know, how super the spouse is. Provincial nominee program. So we're just going to talk about that a little bit. And so it's not all provincial nominee programs that will give you 600 points. It has to be express entry linked. And if you do have a provincial nomination, you're basically assured, irrespective of the other points, that you will get a nomination. Okay. Previous study in Canada, that will give some points. So if they studied in Lambton College, for example, they get 15 points, which can be significant. Arranged employment. Now, a lot of people, for example, will go to their employers and say, can you apply for LMIA for me? Because I need to have these points for arranged employment. This is what they're talking about. You can't get arranged employment with an open work permit like the postgrad work permit. You need to have either employer-specific work permit like a NAFTA or a free trade work permit, or you have a francophone work permit, or you can have an LMIA-based work permit or LMIA. If you have brothers or sisters who are Canadian permanent residents, you get a few points. Fluency of French can make a huge difference. And then there's trade certification for the trades. Okay, so, you know, people often say, oh, it's so easy now to get permanent residence. It may not be as easy as before. it's not everyone who has the highest for all of these. And remember, it's all a competition. So some people, they may have extensive experience, extensive, and maybe very, very hardworking. And they, but they're a little bit older. And the system does not recognize those specialized skills that they have. Specialized skills are not part of this, right? And so it just depends on the individual person, and what their situation is as to whether or not we can put them through this particular system, and they would be a good candidate for this. So one last thing that I wanted to talk to you about Express Entry is a provincial nominee program that is linked to Express Entry. In Ontario, our provincial nominee program is called the OINP, Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program. And how our system, the OINP Express Entry linked provincial nominee programs work is you can't apply directly to them. You have to first be in the Express Entry pool and wait to see if they will send an expression of interest. And who do they like? Who are they going to send expressions of interest to? It's not altogether clear. There's no prediction. There is no, it's not like every 2 weeks they send out invitations. The province decides different times of the year to send out these expressions of interest. And there are 3 categories that they can send it out under. The first one is the human capital stream. And this is the one, they have to have a bachelor's degree. It doesn't have to be in Canada, it could be from outside of Canada. And they really look at occupations on this one. They look at, for example, they have already said that they like people in the tech industry. And sometimes they've, for example, invited people under healthcare industries. But they also do look at a person's underlying Express Entry score has to be at a certain level before they will also invite them to apply. The second one is for skilled trades. So these are for people who have worked for 1 year in one of the skilled trades in Ontario. Then they might also receive an expression of interest. And then for French speakers, if they have a bachelor's degree and they can pass their French exam and their English exam to a certain level, they're also, though, in the past year or so, they're also looking at occupations for this category as well. Okay, so that's all I have about Express Entry. Over to you, Zia, to talk about non-Express Entry finally.
Yeah, so some of you may be looking at this and thinking, well, I don't know if this would quite work. Ontario also does have other provincial nominee programs that are outside of Express Entry. So they have nothing to do with everything that Elizabeth has just talked about with regards to permanent residence. When we look at these provincial nominee programs, the applicant doesn't have to worry first about qualifying for Express Entry or creating a profile. These programs are completely outside of the Express Entry system. Now, in Ontario, there are a couple different streams. The first ones that we're going to look at are all those that are employer-based. So for individuals who have a full-time permanent job offer in Ontario, they can go through one of the 3 employer-based streams. Now, when we talk about the employer-based streams, there are requirements on the applicant, there's requirements on the position, but there's also requirements on the employer, so on the company that's supporting the application through this provincial nominee program. Now, when we look at the employer requirements, for an employer that's outside of the Greater Toronto Area, you have to be able to show that in your past fiscal year, you have your income, your gross income has been at least 500,000, and at the current time of your application or of the application, you need to have at least 3 employees that are full-time and that are Canadians or permanent residents. Additionally, your business has to have been in operation for at least 3 years and does need to have, of course, an operation in Ontario. With regards to the job offer, it does have to be a full-time permanent job offer. When we're talking about a permanent position, it's a contract that doesn't have an end date, so it's of an indeterminate length. Both of these are very important that it is full-time position, so anything over 30 hours a week, and permanent, so no end date listed on that contract. Now, as an employer, when you're supporting or when you're considering supporting an application through this Ontario Provincial Nominee Program, you may wonder what documents you need to provide and what exactly that means for you. Well, the application itself through any of these employer-based streams, it is still your employee's application. What they're looking for from you is support in being able to make that application. Now, in terms of what you would need to provide, Ontario has an employer form that needs to be completed. That employer form goes through the business details in terms of, what's the business number, the business name, when did you start operation? It goes through the job information. So what position are you offering, the salary, why that position is important. You also do need to provide a support letter, so an explanation letter that, again, confirms your support of your employee through the provincial nominee program. You need to provide an employment contract. Now, this is generally one that you may already have and have already signed with your employee when they started working for you, but it is important that that contract does have both the company's, like a representative for the company, and the employee's signature on it. And then after the application is submitted, so those three are mandatory documents when your employee is submitting the application. Once the application is submitted, Ontario may come back to you and ask you for further documents. And that would generally be to show that you meet the requirements for the program. So for example, they may come back and ask for T2 schedules to show that what your income or what your total revenue was in the past fiscal year. Or they may come back and ask you about employees. Okay, so to show how many employees you currently have, how long your business has been in operation for. Now, one way they may come back and do that again. This is after the application's been submitted. One way that this is done is that for us, for example, with clients, what we'll do is we can act as that intermediary where documents are provided to us, because of course they do contain information that you may not want to necessarily share directly with employees. And so that with a representative, they may be, for us, for example, we do provide that to Ontario on behalf of employers and on behalf of employees. Now, in terms of the different streams, so like I said, there are three employer-based streams. There's the international student stream, skilled worker stream, and the in-demand stream. With the international student stream and the skilled worker stream, the job offer that is being provided does need to be a high-skilled position. However, the wage requirements for each of these streams is different. For the international student stream, the wage requirement has to meet the entry-level wage for the occupation and the location, whereas at the skilled worker stream, it's a bit higher. It's at the median wage for the occupation and the location. The in-demand stream is a little bit different. There's a specific list of occupations that Ontario will accept applications for this particular program. And in order to be able to apply, the position that's being offered does have to fall under one of those listed occupations. Now, this is the only stream that we see where Ontario has occupations that are considered low skilled, right? So every other stream that we've talked about so far does require a high skilled job offer, a high skilled work experience, whereas the in-demand stream does have low skilled positions included in this program. In terms of the wage requirements, the wage requirement is median level wage, again, for the occupation and for the location of employment. Okay,
Sorry, I was on mute. Okay, so what we have, I mean, this is a lot of information to digest, I'm sure. But what we have right now is some just tips and practical advice for you all as to, what you need to consider right now.
So the first thing is that I think it's really important, and we started talking about this right from the beginning, is know what the status is of the students that you're hiring, and have them provide you with updates as that changes. So we talked a lot in the beginning about the different statuses in Canada, what that means in terms of authorization to work. So it is important, and Elizabeth went over some of the documents that you can request. Think about asking about that status and having the student provide you with updates as that changes.
The second thing is think long-term, right? If someone comes to you and their work permit is going to expire in a year, or even if their work permit expires in 2 years or so, likely what they'll want to do, you'll probably want them to stay longer if they're really good employees. And what they will want to do is stay in Canada for longer. And so inevitably, the question will become, can first of all, the student themselves, is it, can I stay in Canada? And if the answer is yes, but you will need help from your employer, they will likely come to you. And so oftentimes, I think it's important for employers to understand what options the options are for someone to get permanent residence, whether or not they can get permanent residence, and as employers, what you might need to do to help them out.
And then, of course, like we talked about earlier, it is important to have the proper documentation, right? So making sure that you're requesting the documents to support the statuses and the authorizations that your employees will have to work here in Canada.
And I think it's also important if the if your employees need a certain letter from you to provide to, you certainly need to review the information and make sure it's accurate. But sometimes these letters are very, very important for them to be able to qualify for permanent residence, because the government demands that their letters have a certain format. And so, I know that there are certain companies that have certain policies about, okay, this is the kind of letter we provide for employment reference letters, but this is not necessarily the same as a normal reference letter for a Canadian. This is an immigration letter. So, be flexible. Think about, well, you know what, I need this employee to continue to work for us. Or even if it's the right thing to do as an employer to help them get permanent residence, then try to do what you can to provide the documentation that they are requesting. And I would say in the beginning, if you are willing to help them out and help them with permanent residence, let them know. Because in those kind of situations, I can tell you, with our clients who come to us, it makes such a difference with regard to their regard for their employers, their loyalty to the employers. A lot of times, getting permanent residence does require a person to stay with the employer to get permanent residency. But I think it goes beyond that. If you are there for them, then I think, many, many people will be very grateful for that. And that certainly creates a sense of employee loyalty as well. Okay, so we have come to our questions stage. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A button over here. I'm just putting our information in there. If you do have any questions later on, please feel free to email us, and do let us know that you've come to a seminar, and we'll be happy to offer you a discount for coming to this webinar as well. All right, so I think we have 2 questions right now in the question. The first question is someone who is saying that they don't understand why an international student couldn't work in childcare, because there's a lot of childcare positions in Lambton College County. I think what this is referring to is when I said sometimes the work permits have a restriction on the work permits saying that you can't work with childcare. And this is very easy to get rid of. They just have to go and do a medical exam. It's because the government is sometimes afraid if someone hasn't done a medical exam that they might have some communicable diseases that could be passed on to children or in healthcare. That's what it's referring to. So if they have that on their work permit, very easy. They just need to do a medical and then they can get an open work permit that allows them to work in childcare. Zia, the second question is, are there certain LMIEs that are expedited? For example, someone that wants to work in childcare?
So during the strike, Service Canada did prioritize certain LMIAs, such as those in healthcare, I believe. But I don't know that right now they're expediting any particular LMIA unless you're applying through the Global Town Stream, where you see processing times are much faster than the regular LMIA.
In general, the LMIAs I find aren't taking that much time. Certainly there's been times where they've been processed for far longer. So yeah, what are you looking at for regular LMIAs that are not GTS normally for processing?
Yeah, so I mean, there's different streams for regular, right? There's the permanent resident stream, high wage, low wage streams. Each of these are a little different in terms of their processing time, but overall, it's generally about 1 to 2 months for processing times right now. And of course, that does change all the time. But currently, we're seeing it about 1 to 2 months for LMIA applications.
Yes, and if someone's work permit is about to expire and they don't have enough time to get the LMIA decision, what we generally do is we do file the work permit extensions before the work permit expires, just to keep them in status. Right now, work permits take around 5 months to process. And so if they have a work permit and it's in process, they can continue to work. And in the meantime, we can try to get the LMIA and then update the application afterwards if the officer hasn't gotten to the work permit yet.
Elizabeth, can you briefly explain arranged employment again?
Right. So arranged employment is a specific element of express entry where if someone has either a LMIA and that's for arranged employment or LMIA based work permit, or if they have an employer specific work permit and they've worked in the position for a year, and it's a high skilled position, and they have a job offer for at least 1.5 to 2 years or permanent job, then they can get 50 points for normal positions or even 200 points for executive management positions. And so these points can be significant for someone who wants to get selected for express entry. Next, can we get a copy of the presentation? Absolutely. We have recorded this presentation and we will send a copy of the recordings, or link to the recording, and also a copy of the slides to everyone who has registered. Can a student with 20-hour work restrictions work as an Uber driver or a delivery person?
So yes, technically they can. Now, with that being said, because they are limited to the 20 hours a week, the total amount of time, the total amount of hours that they can work in any given week is that 20 hours. And so they would have to monitor themselves to say, okay, how long have I been working for? And then as soon as they hit the 20 hours, they wouldn't be able to work any longer.
And also just be cognizant of the fact that there's a big difference between work experience that's high skilled and work experience that's low skilled. The work experience that we have been talking about for express entry And for the most part, for the OIMPs as well, is all based on high-skilled work experience. The only low-skilled work experience is the in-demand stream, and that's a very specific number of occupations. So in this instance, someone can work as an Uber driver. They are certainly allowed to do so, but this won't necessarily give them the work experience that they need for permanent residency because it is low-skilled work.
Elizabeth, are international students able to work in 2 separate jobs at the same time? So for example, in the morning work at like a childcare position, and then in the afternoon doing retail?
Absolutely. If their work permit is open, or if they are on study permits and they're able to work in any position, as long as they don't go over the hours as students, or they have an open work permit, they can certainly work in any position that they want to work in. Okay. Two more questions. You guys are too fast. Okay. Zia, when the government makes certain jobs higher points for permanent residency, do these jobs stay as higher point jobs forever or just temporarily?
So I think what you might be referring to here is high skilled versus low skilled. What we're talking about there is eligibility to even proceed through these through the express entry system. So the programs that Elizabeth was talking about in terms of skilled worker, Canadian experience class, you have to be working, or you have to have worked in a high skilled role in order to even be eligible through these programs that are processed through express entry. If you're thinking about the arranged employment points, those ones are dependent on, so we already know that the work experience has to be and the job offer has to be high skilled, but even more than that, the points that you're awarded, the 50 or the 200 points, that's dependent on your specific NOC code, occupation code, that you have your job offer in. So for the majority of occupations, they fall under the 50 points, and then it's just very, very specific executive level roles that qualify for the 200 points. Elizabeth, can you give some examples of skilled, unskilled, and in-demand positions?
So, it's not necessarily that you can just tell right away whether a lot of jobs are skilled or unskilled. We normally go to the NOC, the NOC codes that are determined by the government, and the NOC codes had a big change in last year. In 2022, where they adopted the NOC 2021 system. And so some jobs that were low skilled were moved up to high skilled. For example, truck drivers used to be low skilled, now they're high skilled. But certain positions you think are high skilled, for example, tailors should be high skilled, but they were high skilled, now they're now low skilled. So it's not necessarily something that you can just guess at. We do have to go to the government website and to make sure whether or not it's high skilled or low skilled. As for the in-demand stream, that's on the Ontario government's website, the OIMP website. And there are specific occupations. For example, farm workers, personal support workers, personal support workers are now high skilled. So they're if they work for institutions, but if they work in people's homes, and they're still considered low skilled. What else? Factory workers. And it really depends on their occupations. So if you have any situations where you're trying to figure out the permanent residence situation, do come and check in with us, and we can certainly figure out a plan for you. And Zia, are there any bonuses for accepting jobs in rural communities?
So for express entry, no. Express entry system doesn't look at where your job offer is or what community it's in. For the provincial nominee program, the
Yes.
points, sorry?
Yeah, the
Yeah,
points.
for the provincial nominee program, when you're looking at the employer job offer streams, the point system for that particular program does consider where exactly the location of the job offer is. So yes, you know, if it's within the GTA or within Toronto, you're going to have different points versus somewhere in Northern Ontario, for example.
Yes, and even in-demand jobs, there are certain in-demand jobs that can be, you can only do it if it's outside of the GTA, for example, as well. Okay. All right. Well, that's all that we have today. So thank you so much for attending. We will be putting you guys into, you know, what we tell you today is very specific to this day and today, what's happening today. But immigration law does change very, very often. And so the only way we're able to communicate with you as to, you know, changes is to just send you guys some news bulletins. So we'll put you guys in our email list as well. If you don't like it, just unsubscribe. But we don't advertise, we just send you out some news on immigration law after this as well. And we will certainly send you the slides and recording of today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you, Zia, and everybody that joined today. If you have any questions or do want to connect with the Lambton College Alumni Association, you guys can reach out to alumni@lambtoncollege.ca. And any further questions, if you do want to connect with Elizabeth or Zia, stay tuned on that email list.